Hello, and welcome to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 20. This week, Brian and I are staying in the Gospels and looking at the book of Mark, and specifically at the vine imagery in Mark chapter 12. We look at Jesus' usage of Isaiah to drive home the point he was making, how the original hearers would have heard it, and what the opening verses of Mark 12 mean about the nature of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and their relationship with humanity. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, would you mind leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or a review on Facebook? If that's not your thing, would you mind sharing the post about this episode or another episode you've enjoyed on Facebook, or just tell a friend? That works too. We'd love to expand our audience. All right, let's jump into this episode looking at the parable of the tenants and Mark chapter 12. Well, welcome back, Brian.
Hey, Ryan. How's it going?
It's good. It's back in the bistro here.
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah.
little coffee. And
highly coffeed.
How are you?
Okay. Well, we just had breakfast.
Yeah.
With way too many carbs and insanely thick sliced bacon.
Really good bacon.
It was half the pig slice, but it was delicious. So we've eaten an enormous breakfast, and I'm almost to the point of over caffeinated. So.
Okay, well that's good. It should be exciting.
My body feels excited.
You know, I keep thinking there's a reason. We always come in saying, "Oh, we just ate this meal." There's a reason we call this the bistro. Right?
Well, bistro, yes, of course.
Place together around a table, and here we are. We're around a table together today. We're not always together. That's kind of the little secret of this podcast. We're not always in the same room, but
yes, but today we are.
Yep.
You are blessed by my presence.
Something like that. So I've been thinking. I've been worried a little bit because I said I want to make sure. John is a place I gravitate toward. Book of Revelation. These are places I gravitate to, and I look at, and I just don't want this just to become a podcast about the Gospel of John. We want to look at some other areas. Later, I'd say look for some time in the Old Testament. We haven't really looked at the Old Testament much yet, so we're going to look at that. But yeah. I thought we'd look at an account that's I've been thinking about lately in the Synoptic Gospels. I'm going to look at the Gospel of Mark particularly.
Okay.
This account does occur in all three of the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay.
And it's Mark chapter 12. It's the story of it's a parable that Jesus told about the absentee vineyard owner, let's call it, or something like that, or the tenants in the vineyard. Sometimes it's called something to that effect. It's a parable that Jesus told. And, I want to practice some of the things we've talked about. Let's put it in its narrative and historical context a little bit. So historically, this is a parable that Jesus tells during the last week of his life. We've talked before about the Gospels, and you might remember what I've said, Ryan, as we get later in the Gospels and as you get closer to Jerusalem, there's an increasing amount of conflict with the Jewish leaders. And so we have Jesus entering. In fact, just before this, we have the triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's right there in the thick of things, and this is the last week of his life, his earthly ministry.
Things are pretty tense at this point.
And so he makes this triumphal entry, and you might remember the crowds go out and they're using
palm branches.
They're using this language from Psalm 118, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And remember Psalm 118, because we'll come to that a little bit later. But they're using this language in order to greet him as the coming Messiah. They're essentially saying, we believe that you are this one that God is sending into the world. This is what the crowds are saying.
Right.
So the religious leaders that had this conflict with Jesus see this, and they're really upset.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a couple of interesting things that Jesus does here, and I want to talk about the other one later on, but you remember the triumphal entry. If you look back just the chapter before this in Mark chapter 11, Jesus comes into Jerusalem. As he's coming in, he sees this fig tree that is not bearing fruit, and he curses it. And then Mark does, and here's the narrative part of this. Mark does this thing. I'm putting it kind of in its narrative context then. So he leaves that part of the story, and then they go in and what Jesus does then is this temple incident. And I want to talk about this another time. We typically call it the cleansing of the temple, and I call it the temple incident.
Yes.
And I'll go ahead and give you the kind of the reason I call it that is the other way we can understand this is kind of a symbolic destruction of the temple. That for a period of time, Jesus is stopping worship in the temple. And so symbolically, he's kind of saying this is coming to an end and there's something else coming. Mm-hmm. Then Jesus, after this incident, leaves And he goes back, and then Mark resumes his story with the cursed fig tree and has Jesus talking about the meaning of this. So they go back, and within the time they've been there, the fig tree has withered. Mm-hmm. So there's a miracle here, but then there's also kind of a symbolic meaning. And I'll go ahead and tell you, there's two main symbols. I shouldn't say only two, but there's two major symbols in the Old Testament for the people of Israel, for God's people. Mm-hmm. One of them is a fig tree, and the other is a vineyard. Mm-hmm. And so then we get to this parable of the vineyard that I think is an important one for us to look at also. So that we have this parable of the vineyard here going on in this place. So there's a couple of reasons I think that Israel. Well, why would you think that Israel is symbolized by a vineyard and by a fig tree?
Well, I think it's about the growing and producing fruit, and it produces and continues the production process. And it's important as a sustainer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, wine was an important thing. Figs were important, a part of the diet there. Mm-hmm. I would say just in a practical sense, when you come into Israel, that's one of the things in the Old Testament you see, one of the promises is this is going to be a place where there's going to be fig trees, there's going to be vineyards. Mm-hmm. It's a land of plenty, and that's one of the ways it's described. In fact, you might remember when this just came off the top of my head, when they sent the spies in.
Some giants big and tall, some saw grapes and clusters fall.
Right. Well, you might remember they carried
came back with the clusters
these
of grapes.
Clusters that were huge. They were so big they were carried, but on a pole between them. So it was a land of plenty is kind of what that stands for. So here's this, and like you said, then
do you remember that song?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 12 men went to spy on Cain, and 10 were bad and 2 were good.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So there's
okay. Well, I just wondered.
No, I know that song. You're the music ministry part of this podcast.
That's flannel graph material songs right there.
Well, and I remember a flannel graph of these two of these spies carrying on a pole between them this huge cluster of grapes.
Yes.
Okay? So as a part of the way that God was talking about the plentifulness of this land, land flowing with milk and honey, it was a good land. But then, like you said, then symbolically it comes to stand for God looking for this fruit to be produced. So let's read a little bit of Mark chapter 12.
Okay.
Starting in verse 1. Just read for me, if you will, about the first verse, actually. Let's start there.
Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower.
Okay, now here's the thing, and this is, again, one of those things that we're always saying, let's look for, how we understand this. Let's look for a little bit, dig a little bit into this. So we could read this story, and I think most of us know this parable. We could understand this parable anyway. And I'll go ahead and just tell you, the short version is that there's tenant farmers, and the owner of the vineyard sends to get his rents. They beat the servants, they kill some of the servants that he sends and cast them out, and then finally he sends his son, whom they also kill. And we could read that and we could say, oh, this is Jesus talking about the way that he is going to be rejected and going to be killed. So we understand this part of it. But when Jesus, that language again, read verse 1 again, because I've kind of messed it up already.
Yeah, you did.
But that language, just read verse 1 again.
Okay. Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place.
So what we have going on here is Jesus' authority has been questioned by these Jewish leaders. And so he starts with this story, and there's going to be language here that's going to immediately sound familiar to these people who had memorized the Old Testament, these religious leaders who knew their Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And so the parallel I want us to look at here is Isaiah chapter 5.
Okay.
Isaiah chapter 5.
I'm there.
And just read the first couple of verses of Isaiah chapter 5.
Okay. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted with it the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit.
So what parallels do you see here? What do you notice that's similar?
Well, the vineyard, just generally clearing the stones.
Yep. And
watchtower.
Probably even goes along with building that wall. So Jesus says he built a wall around it. When you clear stones, you still see this sometimes in some areas of the country in the United States, for example. You clear a field of stones and then you put those and build a fence around it. So
Yep. The watchtower.
Yep.
We haven't got to the wine press part. And
Well, it says it dug a wine press.
Yep.
In verse 1 there. So all of those are parallel. So I think this language they would have understood. Okay, he's referring back to this idea of Isaiah chapter 5.
Mm-hmm.
Now we call this the Song of the Vineyard sometimes in Isaiah 5, and this passage is really about a judgment on God's people because they are not being the kind of people that God had called them to be. This was a judgment passage in this prophet, in the prophet Isaiah. The leaders would have recognized this. And so they hear this, and then, so Jesus is connecting, I'm saying, and this is one of those things that we can kind of look for, this parable. So what it says here is that in that case, he was looking for good grapes, and it yielded only bad fruit. Kind of reminds us of that fig tree that I just mentioned a minute ago. He was looking for fruit, found none.
Cursed it.
So let's go ahead and read in Isaiah 5 kind of the end of the story. So, because this is something that I think Jesus was intentionally calling to people's mind. So go ahead and read. Go ahead and read 3 through 7.
Okay. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah. And the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress.
So, like I said, you see the judgment here. And what he's referring to here, in Isaiah's context, he's referring to the time when the people are going to be taken away into captivity. Mm-hmm. Now, the Assyrians come, and of course, the people repent, and only the northern kingdom is destroyed at that point. Mm-hmm. But then the Babylonians at a later period of time come because the people continue to be unfaithful. They continue to not yield good fruit, and so they're taken away. So this is the judgment that is made in Isaiah. So going back into Jesus, if he's referring back to this is going to immediately call this to mind. And this is where I'm talking about, when we talk about knowing these stories well, so that, in the same way that the people who heard Jesus' story initially would have made these connections, that we're able to make these connections as well. And you can see it linguistically, you can see it thematically here in the connections. And so that's again what I'm talking about, this idea of looking for these connections. So back in Mark 12, we've only read verse 1 so far. Let me read a little bit further here than verse 2 and following. It says that at harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants, and literally I'll say here, just linguistically, this doesn't make a huge difference, but it says in due time, which the NIV, I'm reading the NIV here, they've interpreted as harvest time, probably the correct interpretation here. In due time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of their vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them he beat, others they killed. So to this point then, let me just say a couple things. First, the concept of tenant farming is probably something that would have been familiar to the people. And most of us are probably familiar with it to some extent. I know my family has the history of this. My grandparents on my mother's side were tenant farmers at one point, where they didn't own the land, but they farmed it, and then they would, of course, were expected to have a percentage, whatever the portion that was required was to be sent, to the owner, and that's a concept we're familiar with. So when the owner sends for these tenants, here's basically the primary point I think that Mark's getting at is these tenants are acting in an irresponsible and a kind of a surprising way. The expectation, they're not the owners, they're the tenants. And so it's almost like they think they're getting away with something by keeping for themselves what rightfully belonged to God. Okay. Mm-hmm. Or I said God, but the owner.
Yes.
I'll go ahead. I guess I gave away the ending there. The owner of the vineyard is God. So these leaders of Israel, I think, Jesus is speaking kind of in a judgment against them. Isaiah is kind of a judgment against the entire nation and their inability to follow him. Jesus is kind of honing this in on the leaders and saying, you've been given a responsibility. Same kind of thing we see with him using the image of shepherd in other places. You've been given this responsibility and you have neglected it. You're misusing it for your own gain rather than thinking about why God has given you this responsibility. So he sends this series, and I think it's important that we have this series of servants. What we typically understand here is that Jesus is talking about the prophets, right? Mm-hmm. That God continued, like Isaiah, God continued to send these messengers to say, you need to pay me the fruit, that is owed to me as the owner of this vineyard. And yet they rejected the prophets. There were prophets that were, killed. They were misunderstood. They were not listened to.
Cast
out. And so this is what we see happening with these servants. So Jesus is kind of recounting this period of time of Israel's unfaithfulness. And yet when God would send a prophet, raise up a prophet, and I always say this, prophets only need to be raised up in times where the leaders of God's people are not doing what they're called to do. If for example, in the Old Testament, if the priests, high priest, kings, if they were doing the things that were pleasing God and leading the people in this way, there'd be no need for a prophet. Prophets typically come. Well, think of some of the examples when you see prophets arising in Israel. Mm-hmm. You see King Ahab's a good example. When Ahab and Jezebel are king and queen, this is when Elijah comes on the scene, right? And he's the one that has to speak to them. Samuel, even at an earlier period of time, we see him coming when Eli is his sons. And so this is a time of crisis for God's people. That's when a prophet needs to arise. Isaiah, his early ministries during the reign of King Ahaz, famously, of course, in chapter 3, into the reign of King Uzziah, and then we have Ahaz. And so here he is, in this time where, again, the king is going away from what God wants for his people, and the people are following that. And so this is when a prophet arises. So Jesus, again, in this parable, I think is kind of recounting this history. Again, we can understand this parable without that background, but I think that background just kind of, reinforces it, maybe makes it a little bit richer. So now here's where we go. Verse 6 then, this is Mark chapter 12, verse 6. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, they will respect my son. But the tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. So they killed the owner's son, threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Both in Isaiah and also here in Mark, notice there's this question.
What will he do?
Yeah. In Isaiah, the question was, what more could I have done for my vineyard? Right. Mm-hmm. And so there's this kind of, these parables that end with questions are kind of inviting the listener to recognize the judgment that's being made there. Mm-hmm. So, and so in Isaiah, he says, what more could I do for my vineyard? And he's inviting people to say, well, you did, you dug it out, you made a watchtower, you put a wall around it, you did everything you could. And that's when Isaiah says he's talking about his people. This vineyard is Israel. Mm-hmm. The vine is Jacob. So there's that idea, I think, that we have. And then the same kind of question here then is, what will this owner do? And then his answer is, he will come and kill those tenants, give the vineyard to others. And then he quotes this passage from Psalm 118. Now, Psalm 118 was one that was very strongly connected to Passover. I've already mentioned that this is what the people are shouting during the time of the triumphal entry. They're using Psalm 118. Mm-hmm. This was an important passage during, of course, it's the Feast of Passovers when Jesus, this final week in Jesus' earthly ministry. So he quotes 118, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and the Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And so this is, and I should have mentioned one more thing. I'll go back to it in a minute. So the stone the builders reject has become the cornerstone. This passage that we hear quoted a lot in connection with Jesus' death. It's the idea that even though he's not going to be recognized, Jesus is not going to be recognized, that really God is using him as the foundation stone or the cornerstone on which he's going to build this building. That's what's going on here in this place and in this context. And then here's the interesting response to this. Verse 12 says, the chief priests, teachers of law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. So they recognized
they knew it was going on.
But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. So they were able to see in this parable at least for a period of time, they were able to understand that Jesus is making an accusation against them of failing to do the kind of things that God had called them to do. And so I think that's what's going on in this place, in this context. So now, I think there's a couple things that we can do here. Do you have questions or comments in regard to that?
No, I think it's just it's not even the message. I think it's tied back to Isaiah, but also as a prophet and what the message that Isaiah was bringing at the time. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just, it's an Old Testament passage. We've heard this before. It's like the message in Isaiah was tied to judgment for them as well. So it's this concept of he's repeating it, but the same concepts of judgment are coming.
I think Jesus is setting them up, in a sense, to hear this judgment because he's connecting it with this Old Testament passage that they would have known and they would have been familiar with. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's exactly right. So what's the application of this for us? I think there's a couple of different ways that we can see this, or not ways, but there are a couple of different things I think we can learn from this. The judgment context is pretty easy for us to recognize. So let me ask you, you're always asking me, so what lesson does that give to God's people if they look at this time where the leaders of God's people had rejected, what he had said, judgment come on them? What would be the lesson or the message from that, would you say?
Well, I think for me, how I'm thinking about this, and this goes back to an episode we had with John Weatherly, where he talked about, we often think of, in Luke, the Pharisees or something are the guys with the black hats.
Right.
Like that's how being painted, but they were like the religious elite of the day, and they were keeping these things, and then Jesus is coming and saying, hey, I'm bringing judgment on you. And so, I think it's this moving beyond the actions, and it's to the heart of the people and the leaders. Right. Like, the application is, it's not just the way that you act, it's it's your ethos of how you are.
I think you got a really good application there. I'm just gonna make one point here. Look at Mark chapter 12, and you mentioned the Pharisees, and this is where, again, when we read these things quickly, we often just, like you said, it's all the bad guys, right? We don't pay attention. Who does it say that responds here in this case?
The chief priests,
teachers of law, and the elders. So this is a different group. This is more that kind of Sanhedrin, that group that has connection to the temple.
Gotcha.
And here's the only reason I mentioned.
Would there be Pharisees in this group as well?
There could be in the Sanhedrin, but here's what I want you to notice in verse 13, though. And we didn't really go here, so you would have to read verse 13 of Mark chapter 12.
Later, they said some of the Pharisees and Herodians.
Ask him this question. Now, again, we read those words, and it's just like the blah, 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 and the blah, 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 right? Maybe. But
no, it's true. But we just like, okay, and there's another group of people. Yeah, we move on to the question, and these are the bad guys.
So Pharisees and Herodians typically would not have much to do with one another.
Right. So tell us who the Herodians are.
Herodians are those who are connected to Herod.
Right.
And Herod's power came ultimately from Rome. Right. Mm-hmm. And he's the one who is king of the Jews. Literally, that's his title. He's the king of the Jews. He would have been under the Roman emperor, but he would have had the responsibility for this region to make sure that it was, and there are various Herods and people within that family who rule throughout the New Testament period. It's not always Herod the Great. Of course, Herod the Great is dead by the time we get to, early in Jesus' life.
And so, let me just ask you a question on this. Would some of the Herodians also be like connected with the Sadducees then as well?
That would be that would make more sense than Herodians and Pharisees.
Yeah. Okay.
So the Herodians are looking to Rome for their power, right? And the Sadducees are kind of that established power as well. The Pharisees are, be careful here, but they're more the populist, right? They're more the ones that are out, and so their power's in the synagogue, and that's actually, I'm getting into a little bit more than I intended, but when the temple's destroyed in AD 70,
Sadducees disappear, and
the Pharisees are able to continue because they're spread out throughout not only just the nation of Israel, but beyond the borders. There are synagogues at this point in North Africa. There are synagogues everywhere that the Jews, the diaspora we call it, everywhere the Jews had gone, they had set up these synagogues, and the Pharisees tended to be the leaders in those synagogues.
Gotcha.
And the Sadducees' power tended to be centered in Jerusalem,
at the temple,
the capital, in the temple. Yeah. Now, again, I didn't mean to talk about this, but here's the fascinating thing. So the Pharisees and the Herodians, these, what they always say is that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Yeah.
And enemies make strange bedfellows sometimes. So Pharisees and Herodians wouldn't normally have anything to do with each other, but they come together in order to ask Jesus about paying the taxes to Caesar.
Mm.
Now, here's the fascinating thing about that question is it provides a trap, because those two groups are going to answer that question very differently.
Right.
Caesar is the head of the Roman Empire, and so the Herodians are going to say, well, of course you pay your taxes.
Right.
Whereas the Pharisees are going to say, well, we are being oppressed by Rome, and we're no friends of Rome, and therefore to pay taxes means you're not the Messiah, right? You're not this leader that God is sending in their mind to
liberate us from
to deliver us from this Roman oppression. So, again, I only stopped you just for that point because you're talking about the Pharisees, but it really is a different group.
Okay.
And he's going to address the Pharisees in just a moment in a different way. So I think, again, this is a heightening of this. There are several, narratively, let's talk about the narrative here. Mark puts several, they're called sometimes conflict narratives in a row here. We sometimes call this great day of questions, where it seems like all these different groups are trying to trap Jesus, and Jesus responds to them, and shows basically that I'm showing you and sending you in a different way. Mm-hmm. So that's one application back what you said. I think you're right. Here's kind of the way I might put it is we have to be careful to make sure that we are understanding God's will, not imposing our will or what we understand God's will to be upon him, but we need to put ourselves in a position where we're bearing the fruit that he wants us to bear, if you will, rather than trying to do, we're seeking his kingdom rather than building our own kind of thing. And again, they were really trying to take, the vineyard owners, or the vineyard tenants, I should say, in the parable, were trying to take what was rightfully not theirs for their own benefit, rather than recognizing what the owner wanted. And, I think when we come to thinking of our role within God's kingdom, it's important for us to think in those terms. The other thing is this, another lesson. Well, let me ask you this. What do you think that the way the owner acts in this, okay? So think back in Isaiah, the background there, he says, what more could I have done for my vineyard, right? I made it beautiful. And it's kind of like for the people, I've given you this land. It's a beautiful land. You were worried about the Canaanites and all this stuff. I've given you this place. What more could I have done for you? Mm-hmm. And then we have this idea, and some people say the owner's almost, it doesn't make sense that he goes, and when he doesn't get his rents, what does he do? He keeps sending people.
Yeah, it's a definition of an insanity.
Yeah,
do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
And so I guess we could see it in that way, but what lesson would we perhaps draw from that, would you say, about?
Well, God's mercy.
Okay, I think we see
grace and mercy.
I think we see an image of the mercy of, mercy is the word I would use here. I think we see an image of God's mercy in this, that God's patience, we might say, that he continues, he's rejected in the most strong terms. And some people make a point when they're writing about this, well, what did he expect to happen when he sent his son? But the idea that he was willing to do everything that's necessary in order to try to draw these people, back into right relationship. Let's use that word. Even after they killed his servants, the prophets, let's say, then he sends his son. And so I think, again, it shows us something about his mercy and his willingness to do whatever is necessary in order to try to provide, what is necessary for his people. Is another message here that I think that we see in this. But then, of course, ultimately in its historical context, what it is for the chief priests. They understand that they're being called to task, and they, again, just heightens this conflict to the point that they want to do away with Jesus. But when it says the crowds here, and that's really the whole point. Sometimes we miss this in the Easter story. That's the whole point of Judas. They need to find Jesus in a not public setting.
Right, because
they recognize that he is very popular with the people. And so if they try to arrest him in public, if they try to do this in public, there's going to be a riot. That's what they fear anyway. And so So they have to find him in a place. And so Judas is the one who knows where they would go in private to the Mount of Olives in order to pray. And so he's the one who takes him and leads him there. Anyway.
All right, I got a question for you.
Sure.
You know the answer to this because you know more history and some early rabbinic literature. How did those in Jesus' time look back on the prophets and what the nation of Israel had done to them? Did they say, like, we have done these people wrong?
They would have seen that. They would have seen that. But, of course, it's like when we read a Bible story, and I think this is actually a good lesson for us. We always want to put ourselves in the position of the good guys in the Bible stories, right? And so I think when they would have read it, they would have said, "Oh, but we're not like that. That's the way that the leaders used to be. But now look at us. We're the ones who are truly leading Israel in the correct way." You get what I'm saying? So I don't think they would have identified with it. And what Jesus is doing is he's saying what you're doing right now in rejecting me is you are putting yourself in this role of being against me. And that's why, the first application I wanted to mention was this idea of judgment and us being careful to think, we want to immediately put ourselves in, we're
not doing that.
We're doing the Lord's work. And I think we need to ask ourselves, are we being true to the owner of the vineyard, right? Or are we trying to just aggrandize our own selves,
Yeah, well, it's the the rhetorical question. Well, what if Jesus came today?
Yeah. How would we respond to him?
How would we respond?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
We would know it and we would accept it and there'd be no problem. So I just wondered how those the chief priests and the elders looked back on that and kind of saying like, oh, they were good and we recognize they were from God. And then, thinking, I'm just trying to envision how they pictured Jesus in their context, this guy who's performing miracles and seeing these things and kind of going, is this, I'm trying to think about the cognitive dissonance to kind of go, he's not a prophet though.
Well, and that's exactly the kind of conversations that we see going on. John, I think it is. Of course, it's always John for me.
John. All roads lead to John.
But there's a statement, because he's saying things that they're taking as blasphemy, right? Because he's saying, well, I'm not just the king. I'm really equal with God.
Yeah,
and they're going blasphemy. But on the other hand, the response is, when the Messiah comes, what more could he do than this man has done? He's opened the eyes of the blind, raised the dead, he's caused the lame to walk, all these things that Isaiah prophesied. What more could the Messiah do? Right? So there's some people who are persuaded by that, and yet there are others, because he does not fit their paradigm of what it is that God is doing in their context. Okay.
Yeah.
So again, take that and put it in our, because it does not fit that. Well, that can't be from God, right? He doesn't matter what he does, and that's the thing, the idea of the signs, and I've said this to people before today. You talked about, well, what if Jesus came today? And, I've heard people say, well, if we could see miracles the same way that we saw them in Jesus' day, then I would be a believer. But, why do we have these stories about what Jesus did back then? And my point is, well, the problem is with your point of view is, the scriptures make clear that even those who were eyewitnesses to the sign didn't necessarily believe who he was. They saw these things, and yet because of their own heart and because of their own stubbornness, I don't know what all you want to say, their setness in their ways. Maybe that's a lesson for us there to be, it's a fine line between, I think we need to be open-minded and listening and willing to hear. We have this tendency to, and even cognitive scientists have showed us this, the confirmation bias.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That we need to be self-aware enough to see areas where we are perhaps not looking at the evidence completely, this kind of thing. So,
yeah, well, and I guess this is my question. We talk about, this is a podcast all about the Christian faith and,
right.
The application here. How do we make sure that we're not blinded?
Yeah.
Because I think
that's a great
we
question.
all can have blind spots. Yeah. How does a community make sure the community doesn't have
I can think of a couple
spots?
things. You give me a couple of years too, as you think about it. But
my own blind spots, or
yeah, let's have a series of them. But
I don't know if you know this, Brian, but I don't.
Well, once you learn Greek, no. But I think a couple things is, one, you mentioned this idea of Christian community, and we need to understand that the kingdom of God is much bigger than people who look like us and think like us and sound like us and have a similar kind of culture than us. So there's a couple ways I think this is important, is to be in conversation with Christians who have other perspectives, to be in other, and I'm talking primarily cultural. That's one of the reasons, and there's lots of debate about short-term mission trips, and we haven't talked too much about this at this point, but, I've belonged to a mission organization in the past. I worked with a mission organization in the past that had short-term trips, and one of the things that we were very intentional about, that I think you need to be careful for, a short-term mission trip isn't just about us going down and helping those poor people in those other places. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, one of the primary goods, if you will, one of the primary beneficial things that come out of these short-term trips is the ability to have interaction with believers in other cultural contexts, and we can learn from one another. We use this phrase all the time in that mission organization, mutual transformation. We believe these trips are mutually transformative. And again, as Americans, we kind of have some time, I'm speaking in
a little
context.
Superiority complex.
Well, and we kind of feel like, we have the tools to help people. We can go down and help. And there are things we can do. Don't get me wrong. But there's also a way in which we can learn from one another in those contexts. And we can begin to really see what is crucial to the Christian faith, what is important in these contexts. One of the things in the past year or so, when we've had, for a while could not meet together, it was very difficult. And different, let me say, different churches made different decisions about this. And I said from the beginning to our congregation, all of us, we need to respect the decisions that other congregations are making, because we're all in these different kinds of contexts. But you go, people were talking about, well, I really just don't feel like we're worshiping unless we're together in the building. And I'm thinking, if you go around the world, there are people who don't have buildings. Mm-hmm. They're meeting together under the trees, or in the gardens, or, in homes. And are we somehow saying that's not quote unquote church? Again, I don't like to use church in that way, right? Going to
that
church.
God can't meet us in these under the tree, or
right, as a community where they're gathering in these places. And I think, again, that's something we can learn from one another, to see how, in some ways, what we feel like we need, the projectors and the electrical instruments and the fog machines and
yes.
I'm sorry, I'm getting a little carried away here, but. And again, we have to think about our context. In context, I'm not criticizing that either, but I'm saying we need to also recognize that there is legitimate worship in other forms and other contexts. So I would say this kind of idea of being in conversation with other people, taking opportunities that we can to live life with people who are different than we are, whatever that looks like, whether it's a short-term trip or intentionally long-term, building relationships, probably even better, friendships with people who are different than we are, maybe even speak different languages than we do, so we can understand better. Those are a couple of ways I think that we can be aware of our own biases. I think even just learning about history and other people, I think can be a good thing. It never hurts to pray and ask God to show us those areas in our life where we may have blind spots also. But what do you think? Do you have any ideas or any thoughts on some of that?
Gosh, I haven't learned Greek yet, so I don't know.
Well, once you get that, you'll figure it all out.
Once I learn Greek, the whole world just falls in place. I think it's, engaging in those conversations and I've been on mission trips. We talked about when I was in Ukraine in 2005, and you saw how the church existed in a very different cultural context, and a context that had come out of some really hard, some hard times there when it was the USSR. So it was, seeing that, and I mean, that was challenging for my faith in some of those ways, and how I look at what I do here, and I've been in Poland, and I've seen things there, and that's very much more Western, but it's this different cultural context. And so I think, yes, like you said, learning from others. And I guess one of my things is, and maybe you can talk about this, because I think, how do we discern some of that stuff sometimes? Mm-hmm. Because I'm not saying we have the corner on the market on everything. It's like it's this community coming together that the church and Revelation, we see every tribe, tongue, and nation in there. How do we make sure, though, as we bring all this together, that we're having an honest view? You know what I mean? Like, because there are cultural contexts that lean a certain way, but maybe it pushes it too far, theology too far in a direction.
Well, I think, I don't know that we're ever going to have an honest view.
Yeah.
So I think the main thing there is having the humility to recognize that my view is not equivalent to truth.
The
Right?
view.
That I am seeking, so again, for me, Scripture is a very, very important part of this. I'm seeking to understand what God is doing both in history and also in the present. I want to have eyes that are open to that. I think having brothers and sisters speaking into me, even those with whom I disagree, is an important part of that. Being in dialogue, and I'll say that's a thing that we've lost, I think. You mentioned this idea of Ukraine, and let me just give you one example maybe that will help. Is I sometimes hear, I try to be pretty positive about the future of the church, right?
Yes, you do.
But there are times where people will, our attendance is down, 10% or whatever. And you think, there are Christians who, like you said, have gotten through and today are going through persecution, but have gotten through very difficult times. And the church has survived, right? The church has been victorious in those elements.
Yeah.
And I think just even changing our perspective about what it means for us to do God's work, right? It's not always about the big productions, but it's about, I think it was Dallas Willard. But ultimately, he says the kingdom of God is something that passes from one human heart to the other. At the basis, it's a discipleship kind of movement where we're, whatever kind. It's not big groups assimilating. It's more one heart sharing the gospel with another, and that heart responding. And so I think he called it a revolution of the human heart. I'll have to look up that reference, but that, I think, to keep that in mind, that what we're doing is more about the people right around us than these big kind of things, and trying to keep that proper perspective, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Also, to make sure that we're on board with what God's doing. So
yeah, and you mentioned like reading books, histories, and understanding I've been reading. I'm not making any comments on current culture, but I've read stuff about like how the church thrived in communism, and it's these small groups, and it was people to people, and it was like in these small, there was no production, there was no building. It was, we meet here, and it's encouragement, and it's meals, and it's going that way, and learning from them and seeing their faithfulness in that. And
there's a church in Cuba today. There's the churches in Cuba. That the church is in these places, and now in North Africa and some of these places. I have students who are serving in countries where they can't be there officially as missionaries, yet they are sharing the gospel with people in very difficult circumstances. And so, I think all those, to remember that the church advances even in those difficult contexts.
And all this is to keep our eyes on what God's mission is. So we're not the tenants that keep pushing away and thinking, we're seeking our own advances, but we're seeking the advances of God. And so, very good.
Okay.
Anything else you want to add to that?
I don't think so. I think that's about all I had with that today. I just thought it'd be good to look at something different than John for a while, and bring, even though we're still talking, I guess, about the temple and about those kind of images, but the image of Vineyard. Now, I will mention that, just if you haven't gone back and listened to some of the stuff we did on the temple in the Gospel of John, that the temple itself had this relief of the vine on it, which again stood as kind of a symbol for Israel. It was something that they would have seen in Jerusalem. It's something that they would have thought about on a regular basis. And I was going to say this as well. I forgot two other things. One is that last time it says owner of the vineyard, the word there is actually kurios, which is the Lord of the vineyard. And I think, again, Jesus is kind of bringing this in to make sure we understand that the Lord is the owner of the vineyard. But the other thing is this: we're familiar with, depending on what part of the country we live in, if we live in the United States or someplace else, we may have seen vineyards. There's some places where vineyards are more plentiful than others. Israel is one of these places. Galilee, particularly, is one of these places where that's a part of the culture. Same way, we're right now in a place where you see corn and beans, right? And maybe a little wheat.
Yeah.
There, it was vineyards. That's one of the main things. Olive groves, fig trees. These are the things that you would have seen. And so it would have been, vineyards would have been very familiar to you. And so I think Jesus is, again, drawing from the familiar in order to make this point. So,
very good. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Till next time.
Yep. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Next week, Brian and I are taking a look at some recent archaeological discoveries that help enlighten the stories and message of Scripture. We hope you'll join us for that. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com, as well as sign up for our email newsletter to stay in touch, but also to get some exclusive content we are working on right now. You can find us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Bible Bistro. And as always, you can subscribe to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Just search for Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next Tuesday.